Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Demai, Pedig Beis, Halacha Gimel, and Halacha Dalet. We're going to be learning today Daf Chaf Aleph. We left off on Daf Chaf Amid Beis, Mamish on the last line. We introduced yesterday that when you go from being either an Amaretz or a Neman into upgrading yourself into a Chaver, not only do you have to make these public commitments, but when it comes to commitments of your greater, more stringent adherence to the laws of Tuma and Tara, you make that commitment in stages. That is where we left off. First stage is that you're going to keep Netilas Yadayim, and as we explained, Netilas Yadayim is not exclusive to a Chaver, but that's the Netilas Yadayim that we do nowadays, that originates in the Takon of Shlomo HaMelech, that we have to wash our hands prior to eating a meal of bread, or just to add, that if you have food that's wet prior to eating that food, you have to do Netilas Yadayim. As we learned so many times, that midrabanan, if you touch mayim, the mayim goes back to being a rishon, even if your yadayim are stam shniyos. That's the amazing power of water. Normally, when you pass on tuma, it goes a step down. There are times, the Tumas Mishkav Moshe, for example, it keeps it on the same level. But this rabbinic power, that even if your hands are yodayim, if you touch mayim, the mayim goes back to being a tchila, goes back to being a rishon, which then has the power to be metama, even chulin as a sheni. That is why, for example, the night of the Seder, we wash our hands before we have the karpas. All of that is not exclusive to a chaver. But what we did speak out, which is really based on a Rashi, in the Gemara at the end of yesterday's shir, is that the first commitment that this person has to make, it's called makrivin liknafayim, that we draw him near. That's an expression used when someone becomes a chaver, chaverim, they become closer, when he commits to his wings, which means to his hands, which means the netilas yadayim, which means that he is committing that he will never touch food prior to washing his hands. That's a chiddush. Never to touch food. Forget about eating. Not even touching food. That's this extra stringency. We're going to continue learning now the other stages that you have to commit to. This whole idea of yelchul mechayel el choyel. Sometimes you have the avodah of jumping, right? About tshuva, right? Berega chada b'shayta chada. And sometimes you have this gradual avodah, as we will see. And then we're going to learn about a person who possibly would lose the chaver status and yet would be able to revert back to it without making a new commitment, which will be the exception. Normally, if a person loses their status, to get back the status, they have to recommit themselves in public. There will be exceptions to that case. That will be more or less the sugya on Daf Chaf Aleph all the way until Halacha Daled, until the two Mishnah. Halacha Daled, again, is a big topic. Halacha Daled is premised on the following rule, that normally it is the seller's obligation to tithe. When it comes to eating kosher, for example, the obligation is on the purchaser. But if I'm going to eat it, I got to make sure everything is okay with it. That's not the case by normal tevel. By normal tevel, the chiyuv of separating the trumas and the maasros is on the original owner, or if there's a seller and a buyer, on a seller. That is the basic rule. The exceptions of the rule, that's already diving into the Mishnah, is that this rule by Demai is also generally applicable, that anyone selling Demai has to first tithe the Demai obligations, right? Trumas or Meiser or Meiser Sheni. Well, that does not apply in all the cases. In certain cases, we will learn it will be the buyer's responsibility. And yet in other cases, it's going to be some of the seller and some of the buyer. As an example, that if you have a baker, now we're going to speak more details from whom did this baker, the chaver, buy the flour or the grain. And also to whom is he selling it. All these things will speak out when we learn the sugya. But the Mishnah says that when you have a baker, now obviously, if the baker has to do anything, he's a chaver. And Amaretz won't listen to any of these rules. But a baker who bought flour and grain, let's say from an Amaretz, our Mishnah says the baker has to separate the Trumas Meiser, the my obligation, and obviously Challah, right? He's making the dough, prior to which there was never an obligation to separate Challah. That's on the baker, who's the seller. The buyer has to separate Meiser Sheni. In other words, the Yesod of the Mishnah will be is that again, normally the Chiyuv of Tevel and of separations is on the seller. And by Demai, it's also that way as a rule, but there could be exceptions. And some of those exceptions will not be that it's all on the buyer, but it's chatzi, like some on one, some on the other. In the case of the baker, Trumas Meiser, I'm adding challah, even though challah is not connected to the mai, but that's just a fact that the baker, when he mixes the flour and the water, from then you have the chiyuv to separate challah. So the trumas meiser and the challah goes on the baker. The meiser sheni will go on the buyer. We will learn inside why is that the case. And what we're going to go from there in the Gemara is a blatant contradiction that this same case, l'cho'ura, is going to be the opening case in the 5th chapter of the mai. Today we're learning Daf Chaf Aleph. It's going to be in our pagination on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis. And the Mishnah over there says that the buyer is chayv to separate everything, the Trumas Meiser, not the baker. And we're going to find various ways to reconcile our Mishnah and the Mishnah later and more. But let's go back to where we left off, Daf Chaf Amud Beis. Right, we began yesterday with the Braisa Makrivan Leknafayim, and only afterwards Malamdim. This is not a one quick jump of a commitment. It's too much, step by step. And the first is knafayim. And as we said, knafayim means wings. Being that after Natilas Yadayim, one is supposed to lift one hand, which is something that we do until now, that's why we call it wings. And indeed, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak be Rabbi Elazar, that first the commitment is knafayim. But unlike we had in the Braisa only spoke about 2 steps, knafayim, and then litarois, Rabbi Yitzchak, but Rabbi Elazar breaks it down into more steps. First knafayim, and now how long does the person has to adhere to that upgraded commitment of every time he's going to touch food, he's going to wash his hands? I don't know. I would guess 30 days because we had that number before. And then the next step is a commitment for madafos, which is an unusual word. So the Mara Fuldam at the end of Daf Chaf Amud Beis, knafayim madafos kach sidran lechatchila liknafayim kama v'achar kach madafos. What's madafos? So madafos says the Mara Fulda vehein tumois kalos derabanan. Any light level of tuma, though it's not being careful from tuma on the level of an av. Why are we calling lenient or lighter tumas with the word madafos in the plural or madaf in the singular? Something that's un or insubstantial, something that's very light, like a leaf. That's a lashon in the pasuk. Lashon davar kal. That is the next step. And after he is careful in the lower levels of Tuma, then lehaseitois, turning to the Chaf Aleph, Amud Aleph, what's a seitois? So as we mentioned, right, you have the Zav and the Zava and the Nida and the Yoldas. Not only do they have the capacity of imparting Tuma, on their level, they are an Av, and if they sit on something meant to be sat upon, or they lay on something, or they write on something, that item acquires the tum of an av. But there's also another type of stringency we find by them, is that what happens if there is indirect contact, meaning hesed. Hesed means if I move something. Now, when I move something, the normal way of moving something is also touching it. Maga, the touch conveys tuma in all cases. Hesed means that even if I don't touch something directly, so I am touching item number 1, and I'm moving it. And item number 1 is touching item number 2. So item number 2 is being caused to move by me. I'm being maced it, even without touch. That also will acquire tumah. These are very stringent tumahs because it's coming from people that have a tumah hayotze migufam, which puts them on a higher chumradika level. That's the heseitos. So you have to commit to be careful by the tumais chamurais, and finally taharis maisres. Now taharis maisres, I know there are different ways that the Noise Kalim explain it, but as we have learned, we learned to some psachim and many other places in Bavli, that even though chulin only goes down into a sheni, one of the stringencies that we have by truma and by kachim over chulin is that it's more sensitive to becoming tamei. Truma can even become tamei, puzzle on the level of a shlishi, and kachim can even become tamei on the level of a revi. So that is going to be the final commitment that the chaver has to make in public. He's going min hakal el hakavod. Now you would argue, why don't you first make a hachlata that you're going to keep the more serious ones, right? When we learned before Madafais, the Marafulda says it's only Tumah Midrabanan. Don't you think that someone should first commit to keep the Doiraisis and then to keep to the Rabbanans? That's normally it. Well, yeah, that's normally the way it works. But on the other hand, the commonality, the difficulty of keeping the Tilos Yodayim is definitely the greatest. You'll never touch food. In other words, actually, what you're doing is that you are making a resolution to modify your behavior in the hardest way. There are less cases of Zav and Nidan Yoldis. There's less of that. So you're going Merakoved al Akal, which is interesting. But that's the way you do it. In other words, you make this big resolution, but the big resolution is to cover that which might be most common. And then you go to something that I would argue is less common. Then you go to something that's even less common. Truba and Kachim for a non-Kohen is even less common. What contact do we have with it, especially with Kachim? Doesn't matter. But you have to cover all the bases. But you don't go to all of the scenarios at once. It's step by step by step. That's the full stage system of someone becoming a chaver. Now, until the Mishnah, we're going to learn interesting halachas. In the times of Chazal, the way governments would collect taxes is that every village, every area would have a government-appointed tax collector. Now listen to this, guys. The government tax collector would pay the government out of his own pocket the number the government wants to receive from that locality. So if they look at a city like Los Angeles and decide from this city you want to get paid $50 billion a year tax. So the way it used to work is that some wealthy person would give the king the $50 billion. And now this is a business, would have the right to go to the citizens. He lives there, and not only will he get back his $50 billion, but it turned out that they would extort exorbitant meshugana amounts of money. That's the way they did it. And they gave favoritism. They had a friend Chaim. They gave Chaim a break. They made it up by charging Yankel. And they were viewed as mamish robbers. The worst type of robber, because you can't stop them by calling the government. They represent the government. So a gabbai tzedakah was a type of livelihood that a person who has that loses all of his nemanus of being a kosher person. Now let's read the Gemara inside. And this is a braisa. Initially, we used to say that if you have a chaver who has his parnasa, he becomes a gabbai. Here, a gabbai means a tax collector. V'cheskason, then to be pashit robbers. So we right away don't allow him to be a chaver. He's no longer considered a chaver. And what's not only that, but look inside the second line from the top, the Marafulda. Even if he resigns from that position. We were so repulsed by his choice of becoming, even for a very short amount of time, into a tax collector. You got involved with it, you are never able to come back to being a chaver. That is how it used to be. But that was too strict. Back inside the Braisa. Chazru loymad. Calls manchu gabbai. No. As long as he's functioning as the gabbai, as the tax collector, and achanami. However, but once he resigns from that position, now here's the word, he automatically reverts back to his original position. Because this is a person that never lowered his standards to our knowledge in his adherence to the laws of Tumas U'Maisves, in his carefulness when it comes to the laws of Tumantara and all of the laws that we learned above. Problem is he's a tax collector. So initially you became a tax collector, you can never be a chaver, you never revert back. Chazru Loimar, and this actually motivated people to give up that way of making a living. Chazru Loimar, that you yotzim megabi yusay, hareo kachaver means you automatically become a chaver. You don't even need to make the recommitment. A person is a chaver, and we see that he's no longer careful of the laws of Tum and Tara. He can do tshuva, but he'll have to make another commitment, as we learned above. Not this guy. This guy never lowered his standards to Tum and Tara. The derech tzachos, I know we have over here a gabbai, that one of the just a fact, a gabbai has to give up some of his friendships because that's what happens, because everyone has a system, and the mispalalim don't always agree to the system of the gabbai, and it's inevitable that people will be insulted that you didn't give me this aliyah, didn't give me that aliyah. That's how it goes, and that's the job, and that protects the rabbi. The rabbi can be kaviyachal, the nice guy, and the gabbai has to take all of the beatings. And when he's a gabbai, the Barais is saying that that if he resigns, our gabbai is not allowed to resign. But if a gabbai that thinks he can resign, he becomes everyone's friend again. Now, another type of lowering of standards, not connected to Tum and Tara, it's more connected. A chaver who goes to Chutz La'aretz. Now, the Chazal said it's mamash in middle. Look inside the Rashidil, middle of there. It's a big right column in middle of it. First of all, you're not allowed to go to Chutz La'aretz. I know there are exceptions. Number two, that's what's negeya here to being a chaver. Chutz La'aretz temeya mishum gezeretz eretz ha'am. That Chazal made a takana first on the Gush Eretz Yisrael, and then even on the Avid Eretz Ha'amim, that it's Tamei. Rabbinically, you go to your Tamei. So if a person, a chaver, goes to Chutz La'aretz, guys, that's not like a gabbai tzedakah. Here you are lowering your standards by Tum and Tara. Like this is a guy who's washing his hands before he touches food. If he goes La'eretz Ha'amim midrabanan, he's Tamei meis. So there's no doubt that while he's Chutz La'aretz, he's no longer a chaver. Here again, the question is, what were to happen if he goes back to the Holy Land? So when he goes back to the Holy Land, says Chia b'Rabbanan Rabbi Yechanan, Ein doisen oisem achavurasan. Ein doichen means that he doesn't even have to make a new commitment like we had before. Now remember, if we learned yesterday, right, by the Rish Lakish, right, that Rish Lakish was not a chaver. People were asking, why would he not become a chaver? Even though he was a teacher, he was not a chaver. Maybe it could be that people that for the permitted reasons of going to Chutz La'aretz, maybe Rish Lakish, you would go there to give classes, I don't know, in Chutz La'aretz. People that would go to Chutz La'aretz, they would lose their status of a chaver. Here, Rabbi Yechanan and a Chanami, when you're there, you're not a chaver, but when you come back in, you're automatically a chaver. And the Gemara is going to have a problem on that. That it can be. If you lose your status, you should not get it back automatically. Why not? Look at the way the Gemara is asking it. Katan. Now, keeping up with all of the detailed laws of Tum and Tara requires a lot of knowledge, and you have to get into the habit. Now, if a father of a household is a chaver, he will see to it that his children, even though they are minors, they are upkeeping his standards. However, what happens if the balabaz passes away? So the minor child loses his status of being a chaver, because since there is no father in the home, it's so detailed oriented. No one is there to redirect and to re-educate. So they're not going to be practicing all of the laws of Tum and Tara. And if this minor later wants to become a chaver when he becomes bar mitzvah, he does have to make a new commitment. Why does he have to make a new commitment? Because once you get out of the practice or the detailed practices of a chaver, once you get out of it, you have to relearn it. You have to reorient yourself. So, frag die Gemara, hakatan ein tzarech kiruf. Hakatan means if you have an orphan child, That used to, because when his father was alive, he had the status of a chaver. Then there was a while in which the father was not there. Now he wants to become a chaver again. Does he not have to make a new Kabbalah? Yes, he does have to make a new Kabbalah. And therefore, the kasha against Rabbi Yechanan so learns that Asherilio, that if you have this chaver, that he goes to Chutz La'aretz, while you are in Chutz La'aretz, de facto, you're Tamei Midrabanan. You're not keeping the dinam of chaverus. So when you come back to Eretz Yisrael, you should have to make a recommitment. That is the kasha we have on B'Shem Rabbi Yechanan, and the Gemara doesn't answer that kasha. Even though we're already familiar, even more than in the Babli, not answering doesn't mean at all that Rabbi Yechanan backs down. I mean, there is a difference. The difference is that a minor might not be able to retain all that information. Masha Enkein, the adult, the chaver who himself made that commitment, he can remember. He can actually continue to wash his hands in Chutz La'aretz. He can continue to familiarize himself or to keep the habits that you have to have in Eretz Yisrael, even though he's Tamei, he knows that. And that's why B'Shem Rabbi Yechanan, that if he's a chaver, unless we see he's breaking the laws of chaverus, he does not have to recommit himself. Atkan, halacha gimel, and now we're starting the new Mishnah, halacha dal. And as we spoke out in our words of introduction, and this is important, that I want to go through a couple of steps to better appreciate the sugya. When we deal with kashrus, right? For those of us who are learning the 3 chapters of Rambam, right? That's where Mamash Rabbi into. Upon whom is the responsibility to be concerned about kashrus? Upon the buyer, upon the eater. That's the way it works. Yes, we all know that midrabanan, a Jew cannot sell treif, for I understand that. But just the way we understand. I'm eating the food, I have to see to it that the food is kosher. By Tevel, it's not that way. The general rule is that when it comes to separating Trumas from Maasros, the obligation is not placed on the buyer. Right now, you have to appreciate. In contrast, Tevel is the exception. The obligation is placed on the seller. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is that even though Damai to begin with is also a midrabanan, but they made it like Tevel. That also generally, this idea that the achrayis of making sure that the produce is fully, properly tied, also on the level of Damai, also generally falls on the seller. But since it's Damai, in the cases of Damai, we will have exceptions to the rule. And as we will see, sometimes the exceptions will be all the way, which would mean that all of the achrayis is on the buyer. And sometimes that will be the biggest chiddush of the Mishnah. I'm not going to say half and half because the quantities are different. We're going to have these exceptions that some of it will be on the seller and some of it will be on the buyer. And don't forget, guys, there's only really 2 things that has to be done to the Mai. And that is Trumas Meiser. Even though be'emes, in order to get Trumas Meiser, you have to separate Meiser Rishon again. But since you get to keep the Meiser Rishon, which is how we opened up, we learned the Pnei Moshe and Daf Aleph in the Mai, because of Moitze Mechavera Olav Araya. So yeah, you're separating from the Mai produce 10%. From it, you're separating 10%. In other words, you're separating 1% from the total, and you are naming it as Trumas Meiser, and that is something that you have to give to the Kohen. And then you have to separate 10%, which is a much larger separation, and that is taka to be eaten by you, but in Yerushalmi, or you have to redeem it, etc. So you have to separate Trumas Meiser and Meiser Sheni. Says our Mishnah here. Let's go into this exception. Hanach Toimen, a baker, and we're going to read the Rashirilio. Get your finger in there. What type of baker are we referring to? Before we keep on reading, Hanach Toimim loichibu oisel chulei. Pay the Shanashi that when this Mishnah is brought down in Masechtas Yuma in the Bavli on Daf Chesamid Beis and the Chein Muchach B'Gemara over here, that what are we referring to? What baker? The Benachtoimim Chaverim. Guys, this will be important also for the Gemara. We're speaking about the baker is a Chaver. Step number 2 is he's purchasing either the tfuah or the flour. I want to add another detail. We learned, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, that Amaretz is believed to say that his grain or flour never became wet. We believe him. We give him the money. If it became wet, we don't believe. If he says it never became tummy, he doesn't know. He might be thinking he's saying the truth, but he doesn't know that. In other words, a chaver, a baker, is allowed to buy grain or even flour from an amaretz as long as the seller will tell him it never got wet. It never even became moksha, which is the case of the Mishnah. So you have a baker. Why are these steps important? Because, guys, if the grain owner, Keban, was a chaver, then there's no demai. When I buy produce from a chaver, being that the general obligation of demai is on the seller, I'm good to go. So we're speaking about the raw material was bought from an amaretz. The baker himself must be a chaver. And let me tell you why we can stop. Why must the baker be a chaver? Because if the baker is an amaretz, amaratzim did not listen to these decrees. When you're obligating the baker to do something, it must be the baker is a chaver. Now, to whom is the baker selling? We'll leave that for the Gemara, and that could make a difference. But let's go now. Let's read it in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, the bakers, wow. Here's the big chiddush, that from the demai obligations, all the baker has to separate his trumas meiser, which is 1%, and the meiser sheni obligation is on the buyer. The moment you say it's on the buyer, the Gemara is going to say it. It must be that he's selling it to a chaver again, because we're not going to expect the amaretz to separate meiser sheni when the original owner of the grain claimed he separated everything. Okay, so that's a big novel.
Wait,
what was that?
Why are we asking? We say he's going to sell it to a chaver. How do you know?
I missed that. Kevin, I couldn't hear you.
We're saying the baker is going to. Sorry, we're saying the baker will sell it to a chaver. How do we know that?
No, people were known. People were known. Who's a chaver, who's not. When you lived in the village, it wasn't like in a city here. You don't know who's coming into your shop. You know who is who. Now hold on a second.
So we're assuming everyone who goes to the baker is a chaver?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when he sold it to a chaver, he told the guy who's buying it, listen here, you're doing the meiser sheni, I only separated trumas meiser. I'm not skipping the word challah. I know we're speaking about challah, but there's no chiddush in challah. Challah is not a chiyuv that is chal on the produce prior to it becoming a dough. The one who makes it into a dough is the baker, and that's always the case. Before you separated challah, it's tevel. It's tevel b'negeya challah. But the chiddush is meiser, trumas meiser. Now, why trumas meiser and why not meiser sheni? So both the Pnei Moshe and the Rasher Elio, look inside 3 lines from the bottom in the right column in the Rasher Elio, that v'doichakin al hanachtoimim, that the government would pressure, speaking about financial pressure, all of the bakers, limkar bezoil. When it comes to staple foods, we know this until today, even though we're living in a society where there's a free competition. You can't live mekanish leben if staple foods are very expensive. All of the laws of oina'ah, as we have elsewhere, are primarily to staple foods, to luxurious foods. You can make as much profit as you want. The guy doesn't have to buy it. But coming back to bread, it was common then that governments would force the bakers to sell their product for such low prices that there was barely any profit. Trumas meiser is 1%. Meiser sheni is 10%. And I know that the baker can keep the 10% and eat it himself. So what? But if you're doing a business and you have to begin with already separate 11%, Mistama, that was the whole profit. There's no profit left. So because of that, we go back to the general rule, which is it's kosher kashrus. Let the buyer be concerned with it. When it comes to trumas meiser, which is only 1%, we follow the rule of tevel. We follow, and therefore the rule of demai, that it's placed on the seller. That's the big chiddush of the Mishnah. Now that is b'negeya a baker. Now let's learn b'negeya shopkeeper. Hachen vanim. And we're not speaking about a wholesaler. We're going to have an Mishnah of the baker, the shopkeeper or the retailer versus the wholesaler. Hachen vanim einam rishoyim limkoid as demai. They're not allowed to sell demai. In other words, the chenveni does have to separate not only trumas meiser but also meiser sheni. That's clear. Retailers do make relative a profit, right? They don't sell the quantities of the wholesaler, right? The number of their turnover is smaller, but their margins of profits, it always was, and it's always going to be the way of a retailer is high. Now, let's speak about wholesalers. So says the Mishnah. Now we have different versions, and we're going to go with this gersa. The chol hamashpiyin b'midagasa, all those who sell large quantities at once. Rishoyim limkoid as the mai wow. The biggest chiddush. They don't even have to take off trumas meiser. The Gemara will give the reason, but we already learned by the baker, guys. The less profit one is allowed to make, or one would make, the more of a chance that the Chazal put less responsibility of the mai on that person. Because at the end of the day, like in the case of the baker, when you buy from a baker, you know that you have to separate meiser sheni. So when Chazal say that when you buy by those who sell large quantities, has to be better defined later. But the concept of a wholesaler, the buyer knows I have to separate everything, not only meiser sheni, trumas meiser and meiser sheni. The elu hein hamashpian b'midah gasa. What's that definition? Says the Mishnah, kigoin hasitoinois. Guys, the word sitoinois is a professional wholesaler, and umoichrei tvua means not the professional wholesaler, but it happens to be that sometimes even me, even you, for whatever reason, we happen to gather private people. We happen to have bought, and now we are reselling a large amount, again, to be defined, what's the large amount? So whether you are a professional wholesaler, whether it's a one-time thing, whenever we are going to qualify the quantity as a midah gasa, wholesaling produce, unlike wholesaling tevel, that the seller has to be the one separating all of the trumas u'maistas. If the original owner claimed that it was already done, elamai der amanatzim, so they don't have the manas, all you need to do is that the chiyuv goes on the buyer and not on the wholesaler. So we learned from the Mishnah, the chenveni has no exemption at all. Chenveni is the normal rule that the seller has to, like by tevel. The wholesaler, all of it is on the buyer. And the baker has this nishtahed nishtahin, or half and half. The baker has to be the one separating the trumas meiser, of course, and the challah, and the buyer will separate the meiser sheni. And from here until the end of today's daf, we're going to have a blatant stira in the rule of the nachtem. We're speaking about the first Mishnah of Pedikei of the Mai, happens to be on Daf Lamed Testament days. We're not that far away, even though we are only in Pedik Sheni, but we're going to already hit the 5th chapter, right? And that daf, quoting the Mishnah, if you buy from a nachtoim, keitzar hu ma'aser, turning to daf Chof Aleph Amid Beis, and the Mishnah says, by the way, the Mishnah says over there that the buyer has to separate trumas meiser, and the buyer separates the challah. Oy gewalt. Here we go. Look inside the Rashirilli. He quotes the words. The end of the Rashirilli. Tanon tanina. The common neish pedek chamishi. Daf lametes. The tanan hasam. The lekeyach min anachtoim. The one who buys from the nachtoim mafresh challah. Umasnisim the hachetanan. The hanachtoim gufay mafresh challah v'trumas meiser. We are including the trumas meiser there also. In other words, the Mishnah there goes all the way till the end. So you got a problem. Now, I just want to say one thing over here. Maybe, I have a simple answer. On Pedikei, we're speaking about a nachtoim that's not a chaver. So if the baker is not a chaver, then when you buy from the baker, you separate everything. The nachtoim over here is a chaver. The chiddush is because they would force people to sell for very low margins of profit. You don't have to separate meiser sheni. No one gives that answer. I'll tell you why you don't give that answer. Because when the Mishnah is using the same word nachtoim, we prefer as much as possible, and that will also explain the next couple of lines in the Gemara, to keep them to be as similar as possible. If the Mishnah uses the same word, we want to understand them to be on the same level. And if both of them are chavedim, which is the presumption, the premise of the question, which will remain, if the nachtam is a chaver here, and the nachtam is a chaver over there, mamash astira. Our Mishnah says at least trumas meiser the baker has to separate. The Mishnah in Pedikei says that the buyer has to separate everything, including the meiser, trumas meiser. right? Let's read the words on top of Chafal from the base. At oimer halukech is mafresh. Everything. That's Hocha means the fifth Pedig K. And Vahachen over here in Pedig Beis, at oimer anachlem is mafresh. Taken not meiser sheni, but the anachlem is mafresh. The trumas meiser and the chala gavaldik stira. Is going to have two answers, and we're going to have we're going to want to clarify which Shamaita says which answer. So here we go. Rav Yoina Amar, right? We're becoming more and more familiar with Amar Rav Yoina, that you should know that there is a machloikis, Ispalgun, the Rabbi Elazar. And Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi Elazar was the Talmud of Rabbi Yechanan, but he's also the Baal Pluta and Rabbi Yechanan. How to reconcile it? Rabbi Yoina did not remember who said what, and the Gemara is going to remind us who said what. But let's go to the two answers. Chadam, or one of these two say, Khan means Pedig Beis, Taka over here, but Oise B'Tahara. This is a big chiddush. That we're differentiating whether the baker himself, whether this batch is Tahara or not. Now let me explain the following. When you have something that's currently Tahar, you know what the fear is from Chavedim? You have to just get on. There's a fear that it might become tummy, and therefore, I would rather separate the trumas meiser, which is going to be eaten by a kohen only if it's in state of tada, sooner rather than later. The longer you wait, the more chance. Especially when you are a baker, that means you're not in your own home. No one is going to enter my home, and me and my family are in the state of tada, at least to the best of my knowledge. Doesn't work that way. When you are a baker, you want to do it as soon as possible. That will be the word. So when you do it, b'tara, separate chala ASAP. Separate the trumas meiser. They both go to a kohen as soon as possible. Who is as soon as possible? Not the buyer, the baker. That's a good logic. The kan, meaning over there in Pedig, hey, ba'isa b'tuma. And this concept that since the bakers were forced to sell for a very relatively cheap price, not allowing them to have anything more than a little bit of a profit, so that logic is taken all the way. They shouldn't even have to separate the challah. They shouldn't even have to separate the trumas meiser. So instead of they're going to make 3%, they'll make a 4%. Let the baker make a living. Elama, you are afraid that it's going to become tummy. It's tummy anyways. That's the beauty. That's a good logic. And who said that? We don't know. Either Rabbi Elazar or Rabbi Yechon. The other one of the two say, Khan here in Pedig Beis. Now we're going into something else. So the Mishnah already spoke about the retailer and the wholesaler. What about by a baker? Do we also make a chilik? Do we differentiate whether the baker is selling a small amount or whether the baker is selling a large amount? You have the same logic. So here we can argue b'midat daka. We're speaking about a baker who's selling a small measure. And just like the Mishnah says clearly that a shopkeeper who sells with a small measure, people that sell smaller amounts, they charge more for it. That's the way it works. You're buying retail, you're buying wholesale. If you're buying retail, the buyer is paying more money. The buyer is paying more money. The seller, the baker, can afford to at least take off trumas meiser and challah. The kan, meaning in Pedig Chamishi, we're speaking about the midah gasa. This is gavaldik. In other words, the more you sell, the less the margin of profit. The margin of profit to begin with by the baker, by governmental decree, was very little. On top of that, because of his selling a large amount, the buyers are paying less money. So there's even less profit. I know they're buying more quantity. It doesn't matter. So there, at least, the buyer has to separate everything. Now, Rabbi Yoina did not remember However, the Gemara is giving credit to Rabbi Yoina, but we're going further. Now, again, there's different ways of reading this. Min mad Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Now, we are quoting a statement that Rabbi Yochanan made in Pedig Revi. That what? That the Mipnei HaTaharos, that the difference Rabbi Yochanan did clearly, we know from Pedig Revi, Rabbi Yochanan explained that the difference between Pedig Beis and Pedig K has to do with Tum and Tara. Okay, so that's it. So the first answer is Rabbi Yochanan. The second answer is Rabbi Elazar. Is Rabbi Elazar who the Amar Kamami the Daka Kamami the Gasa. I want to point out that generally this is an exception. Generally, this is something that the Rebbe taught us, that when you have two names of Amiroim, like here, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yochanan, in that order, And then we say Chad Omar. Chad Omar, generally, the first Chad is the first name mentioned, and the second Chad is the second name mentioned. That's the Chiddush of our Gemara. Here is the exception. Right, the first answer is Kanoi Sevetara and Kanoi Sevetuma. The Gemara knows, we discovered later that Rabbi Yochanan is the one that said it. And the Mida Daka and the Mida Gasa was said by Rabbi Lazar. Chavre, let's go a Bissel weiter. We have another couple of minutes. Gemara wants to know the Kasha al the Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, you are understanding that our Mishnah is Ba'isa B'Tara. And I know we already spoke out that there was very little margin of profit, but this is from the Gemara. Well, if that's the case, in other words, if there's no reason, or if there is a reason to be mafresh sooner than later, Ma'aser Sheni, we also would much more prefer for the Ma'aser Sheni itself to be betara. Guys, Ma'aser Sheni cannot be eaten betuma. Let's go to the Ma'aser Sheni that you take to Yerushalmi. So the Gemara says, no, the opposite way. But then, really, hoya shola yafresh klum. Really, you have to go back to what we said in the intro to the Mishnah. The rule of kashrus is that it's the buyer's responsibility to make sure you're consuming it, to make sure it's kosher. Tevel is an exception, but the mai is not tevel. The mai is only a rabbinic rule. And again, and on top of that, this guy is not allowed to make a living. So the Chachamim understand that for this business to be is something that we need bakers. For bakers to want to be bakers, they have to know that if they work, they're going to make enough money to support their kids. So therefore, bedin hoya shelo yafresh klum. Okay. And why is that? Now let me speak out the final step that we spoke of. The kitzur in the intro. We already learned that Ashadilio, our Mishnah is speaking about the baker is a chaver. It has to be that way. For the Mishnah to speak to the baker what he should or should not do is a chaver. It must be that the baker bought it from an Amaretz. Guys, if the farmer was a chaver and the farmer is not allowed to sell tevel, there's no issue. So for sure, both here and everywhere, the owner of the raw material was an Amaretz, which is why this produce is the mine. The baker is a chaver. Question is, to whom is he selling it? Now, if he would be speaking about a buyer who's an Amaretz, that cannot be the case of the Mishnah. Never. Why? Because we have a rule, she'ein moisrin vadai la'am ha'aretz. Gevaldik. Which means, if you're not allowed to sell vadai to an am ha'aretz, which you may not, that's the rule. Unlike kashrus, prior to the rabbinic law, I can sell not prior to the rabbinic law. You got to be concerned with it. Tevel doesn't work that way. So if tevel cannot be sold to an am ha'aretz, certainly the mai cannot be sold to an am ha'aretz because the am ha'aretz for sure won't be mafresh the mai. So our Mishnah is not speaking about you're selling it to a am ha'aretz. You're selling it. You're the baker. You're the chaver, and this client is also a chaver. So since the client is the chaver, that's the beautiful thing. No, you don't have to separate Ma'aser Sheni. You can rely on the chaver separating Ma'aser Sheni. Now, why did they make this dispensation? We said already in the Mishnah, because the baker and mamish could not make a living. In other words, we don't have to. If the Mishnah is speaking about selling it to Hamaretz, you're right. Everything is on the baker. That's a bechlala rule. We're speaking about the buyer is a chaver, and that's why, because of allowing the baker to make a living, we put the Ma'aser Sheni on the buyer. And the same kasha is daf chavbeis. There's still one more line. The kasha al de Rabbi Lazar, that who makes the difference? That our Mishnah is speaking about b'midah daka, and b'midah daka is a reason for the baker who is making a little bit more profit for him to have to separate tumas ma'aser and challah. So the kasha is again yafresh ala koil. Is not the rule that you have to hide everything before you sell it, and the Gemara doesn't have to give the answer that Ashidullah says because it's the same answer. Which is, you're right. If we're speaking about a client, that's an amma audit. That's a very important takeaway. If you're a baker and you were told that to make a living, you don't have to separate the Ma'aser Sheni. That's only if the client is a chaver. The client that walks in there, if the client is an amma audit, of course you have to separate everything. Because since you're not allowed to give an amma audit tevel, you for sure cannot give him the mic. So it's really not such a big of a dispensation. In other words, most people are amaratzim. The baker is selling to most clients. He has to separate everything. there is a little like a window that if the client is a chaver, you get it to tell the chaver leher zachaim. You separate the ma'aser shenim. That goes both for Rabbi Yechina and for Rabbi Lazar. We'll stop here. God willing to be continued.